good afternoon or good morning. Thanks a lot for coming here in person to CRETUS, to our institute here at the University of Santiago de Compostela. And also thank you very much for those who are joining online. This seminar, we have the real honor and great pleasure to have Professor Tony Charles here at the University of Santiago de Compostela for the first time in Santiago, yes. Right? Which is great. Tony is a professor at St. Mary University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada, and is also the director of the School of Environmental, School of Business, and probably is one of the most important experts in the world with more than 30 years of experience working on ocean, food security, climate change, indigenous people, not only in Canada, but also in other parts of the world. Right? So it's, for us, it's an honor to have Tony here and to have the opportunity to hear about his insights and thought, and well, to have this conversation with you, Tony. Thanks a lot, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Y voy a hablar en inglés hoy, pero si hay problemas con la lengua, por favor, da preguntas y cualquier cosa para clarificar. Bueno, gracias. So it's a pleasure to be here. As Sebastian said, my first time in this entire region, and I hope it won't be the last time. So it's very nice to join you here today. I'm going to talk about two aspects together today. One is, as the title says, sustainable fishery systems, and the other is equitable fishery systems. The first topic is the sustainable fishery systems is based on a book that I've done that second edition just came out, and it's shown on the left side of the screen. The equitable part is one that many of you here are focused on, and I'm particularly interested in as well, equity in the ocean, equity in fisheries. So I'm going to combine those together, those two themes a little bit today. So first of all, just to give you an idea again of the book aspect, and actually I do have some pamphlets for those who are here in person if you're interested in the book, and also there's another United Nations piece of work. There's also some business cards there for anyone that's interested. So just to describe the book, because it gives an idea of my interest areas, I guess. I mean, this is, some people produce a book, and for me, this book is kind of indicative of everything I've thought about in fisheries. So let me give you an idea of why it's called sustainable fishery systems. So just 3 words. It is just about fisheries. I'm going to talk today a bit about more than fisheries. But first of all, fisheries as a system. Secondly, looking at the governance and the management aspects. This is just the main parts of the book. 3, about the challenges that are faced in fisheries. 4th, about the strategies to deal with them. And the 5th about, and this was not in the original book that I did 20-something years ago, but now fisheries in the bigger picture, aspects that go beyond just fisheries. And some of us were talking about this earlier today as well. So that book tries to look at all of this. And so if I start, so I'm basically going to pose 3 questions today. What are fishery systems? What makes fishery systems sustainable and resilient? And the third is what makes equitable fishery systems. And I'm not going to answer those in full, but I'm just going to give some ideas about that today. So this is a diagram that one of my students produced for this book that because I was trying to show a system in the way that it actually operates in reality, in the real world. And she came up with this, it's just a bunch of circles and little figures, but what it's trying to show is that the management of fisheries exists entirely within the human system, and humans exist within the natural system. So for convenience, we sometimes look at them a little bit separate from that, but in a kind of realistic way, we have these three interacting aspects. Some of you might be familiar with Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who worked on making social ecological systems a more common term. And she had a similar idea about looking at the governance system, the human system, and the nature system, you might say. But if we focus in on the human side of the fishery, and that circle on the left is just the kind of narrowed in form of looking at fishers and their households and their environment and so on. We have something that I think has evolved over time. When I, a long time ago, was studying fisheries, I would say the main focus was on fish and fishing boats. The fishing boats would catch the fish, and the analysis would all be about how the fishing boats catch the fish. And then there would be something about the market for selling the fish. But there was really no humans involved in any of that. This might seem, a strange idea today, but at that point, it was all about a model of boats catching fish. But when you bring the human side in, and that's something that the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has done 10 years ago, bringing in these guidelines on small-scale fisheries. What they accomplished is what I've been advocating for a long time: a systems look at fisheries. The Sustainable Development Goals that you might be familiar with in the bottom right of the screen are talking about similarly the connection between the environment, the society, and the economy. So that's the idea of the system, especially the human system. And in fact, looking at the system broadly gives us a way, dating right back to 1980s, when the Brundtland Commission developed this notion of sustainable development that has multiple prongs of sustainability and resilience. That has been an important aspect. If we think now about the second question, what are the ingredients of sustainable and resilient fishery systems? The first step for me is to overcome some key challenges. And I've listed 4 of them here, and I'll talk more about each one of these. But just in the context of some of the solutions. So these, in a sense, are the problems. Uncertainty is so prevalent in fisheries. Those who work on the land more, those who work, let's say, in agriculture or in cities or in technologies, when you explain to them that with fisheries, you're trying to manage something that you can't see very well because they're underneath the water. And we know that very well, of course, but it gives them a bit of a pause for thought. Oh yes, well, it would be difficult to decide about something when you can't see it, when you can't see what it's doing. Even those who work on forests or agriculture, where they can see the crops, there's still uncertainties, and there's market uncertainties, of course, but at least they can see what's growing out of the ground. Conflict is one of the crucial aspects, and a very long time ago, I wrote about fishery conflict, and it's been one of those topics that I think is now being looked at much more. And in fact, I know some work is going on that topic right here. Values it's not really a challenge. The challenge is not about the values themselves, but about reflecting people's values in our decision making. And then attitudes. An attitude is basically how we think about the fishery, how we think about nature, how we think about people interacting with each other and people interacting with nature. My argument is that poor attitudes, or what I might call anti-conservationist attitudes, are at the root of a lot of fishery problems. That basically, at times, it's how we look at our interaction with nature. Some of the collapses in fisheries that we've seen around the world have been because people have assumed that nature is indestructible, have assumed that they can put pollution in the harbor and it really won't have any impact because it will just disappear. So all those assumptions are based on attitudes about how the world works. I'd like to just say a few words about 4 strategies for sustainability. Some of these you would be well aware of, some maybe not. First of all, ecosystem approach to fisheries. The idea of ecosystem-based management, which perhaps you use yourselves or might be very well aware of, is some work that I've done with a student, Rachel Long, and a colleague, Robert Stevenson, was looking at the principles of ecosystem-based management in the ocean area from both the what the literature says and what the fishermen say. So looking at the human dimensions of ecosystem thinking. So that's one, ecosystem approach. Second one, rights-based approaches, looking at, and this is a book a couple of colleagues of mine, Derek Armitage and Fikret Burkus and I did, looking at coastal communities, and what we call the coastal cons. So the governance approaches and the rights-based approaches. Economists might talk about rights-based approaches from a different angle from political scientists, for example. Eleanor Ostrom's perception of rights-based approaches could be quite different from some classical economists. But those of us who work with Indigenous peoples have another, and not just Indigenous peoples, but those who work with marginalized communities have a different sense of rights-based approaches, because there is the concept of human rights-based fisheries. So how we look at rights is one of the crucial strategies. Co-management, well, I was just learning some history about co-management in Galicia in fisheries recently, and co-management's been around for many decades. The idea of people sharing management responsibility with governments. CBFM, I'm sorry, I didn't have room to put the term there, so I should spell it out, community-based fishery management. So co-management can be a very official approach. Community-based fishery management can be a much more informal approach. And in fact, that's how fisheries have historically been managed in Indigenous areas, in the Pacific Islands, in many parts of the world. But for the last 100 years, roughly, that's been diminished as governments have taken more control over management responsibility, which has its good aspect. But now we're seeing a resurgence of a community-based approach in many locations, and certainly with Indigenous communities. The fourth topic I had on this list of modern strategies for fishery sustainability is one I'd like to say a few extra words on at some point. Fishery stewardship. Back at the time in the early 1990s, when just off the shore from where I lived in Halifax, Canada, on the Atlantic Ocean, one of the world's largest collapses of a fishery took place, what we call the cod fishery collapse or cod collapse. That was in the early 1990s. And much of my work at that time was dealing with what was happening after the cod fishery collapsed. I was put on a government advisory panel, and I was trying to work with the fishing sector on strategies for what to do after this massive collapse that put 40,000 people out of work. And one of the remarkable aspects that, in retrospect, was a major moment for me was realizing that the coastal communities, the fishing communities along the coast, had much more interest in conservation than was commonly understood. The understanding, if you looked at the old way of thinking about fisheries, is that somebody was responsible for conserving the fish, but the fishers were responsible for catching the fish. It turns out, and this is something again that Eleanor Ostrom demonstrated on land in terrestrial settings, in fact, local communities do often a good job of conservation activity or stewardship. So stewardship is basically taking care of the environment, taking care of the fish, the resources. So I got, over the years, last 20 years, quite captivated by the potential for communities to manage their own resources, to actually, and we could see this after that cod fishery collapse, that the communities were taking a lead in conservation activities. So over the last 20 years, I led a project called the Community Conservation Research Network. And you can see on the left at the bottom a website where we've assembled stories from around the world about not the negative stories, but the positive stories of local communities doing conservation. Not just fisheries, but also forests, land, urban areas, even cities, neighborhoods of cities, where people are taking care of their local environment. So the book on the left side there, which came out through the big international conservation organization, IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that book, which you can get at that website, download it for free there, tells the story of local conservation. The middle book just came out a year ago. It's environmental stewardship by small-scale fisheries, showing how fishing communities around the world are doing conservation, taking care of their fish, their resources, and so on. The QR codes here, if you're interested, are for that publication and for the website that's also down in the bottom right side, what we call the Small Scale Fisheries Stewardship Initiative. It's basically documenting stories from around the world of conservation. Well, documenting is not quite the right word. These are stories that fishing communities and fishing organizations provided to us themselves. So they really are the stories from those fishing communities. They're written in the words of those fishing communities. We just were like a process for putting them into print and on websites. And we're just so grateful to all these communities and fishing organizations that did this. It was supported by the United Nations, but also by the fishing organizations of the world that encouraged their members to send in the stories of conservation. So that's documented in that particular location there. There we go. So I want to move to the bigger picture aspect. increasingly, fisheries need to be looked at in a bigger context than just fisheries. And again, this is something I know is being worked on here. And I'm just going to talk about four imperatives, four important areas that fisheries are now engaging with. So the first is biodiversity conservation. Another book that I did a few years ago that's in the middle here with Serge Garcia and a Canadian colleague, Jake Rice, looked at marine fisheries and biodiversity conservation and the interaction between those. And what that really tried to look at is how fisheries, which discussed a little bit on the left side, and biodiversity on the right side of this diagram, how those interact together. Over time, they haven't necessarily interacted very well together on an official level. In my country, Canada, there's a fisheries department of the national government, and there's an environment department. And often the environment department does the conservation, or they would say they're doing the environmental work, and the fishery department is dealing with the fishery. But actually, there can be big overlaps, and increasingly now overlaps, because for example, internationally, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations that I've shown on the left there, and the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, both big UN organizations, both are coming together around the biodiversity aspect. And to me, the key point that brings together biodiversity and fisheries, or natural resources generally, is the idea of sustainable use. So sustainable, I guess. Sustainable use of fisheries, of natural resources. Because what that means, if you have sustainable use, you have both biodiversity conservation and you have healthy fisheries. So that idea of coming together is so important, but it's not actually an easy task, right? So looking at fisheries, I'm working now with FAO and I'm working with CBD, and the idea is all about bringing things together. And I must say that conventional biological diversity is very good in understanding the importance of sustainable use. They know that if you just lock people away from nature, which is not really possible, people will find a way to do damage to nature. It's much better to have people working in the natural world. Marine protected areas, MPAs, and OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures. What is that in Spanish? Any other language? I'm not sure. OECMs. So marine protected areas. This is a FAO report from a few years ago on the interactions of marine protected areas on the right of the screen with fishery livelihoods and with food security. With that report, we were trying to bring the people into the marine protected area discussion. So trying to bring fisheries and the people involved, the food aspects and the livelihood aspects, connecting with the conservation aspect of marine protected areas. OECMs is very new. It's only been defined in 2018. Like before that, it's existed since 2010, but it's essentially areas that are not officially marine protected areas, but could be good for biodiversity. And so this is a topic that you're going to see a lot about, whatever the acronym is in the coming years, because it's just being figured out now. Different countries in the world are trying to say, well, what areas that we have in our country could be classified as these other effective area-based conservation measures. The reason that's important is that sometimes it's difficult to set up marine protected areas and it can be easier to set up these OECMs. And if you do it right, it counts towards the national targets. Some of you have heard of the idea of 30 by 30. 30% of the area protected by the year 2030. It's hard to do that just with marine protected areas. These other areas give a way to do that. And for Indigenous people in Canada, it gives a really important possibility for those Indigenous people to create their own areas, protected areas. So it's quite an exciting idea. The final one of my 4 points, and this is like the final chapter of the book that I was describing earlier, is about climate change. The report on the left, again from FAO, looks at how climate change interacts with poverty and food security. On the right is a First Nation I've worked with in Canada, Lennox Island. I don't know if you can see the picture on the bottom right of the screen. Lennox Island is a low-lying coastal sandbar. It's just basically sand, but it's facing, like every coastal area of the world, rising sea levels, increasing storms, more extreme weather, and it's actually a great risk, that particular location. So it's called Lennox Island. It's what we call in Canada First Nation. It's an Indigenous area. And this is their home that, like some islands in the Pacific area, is really threatened with climate change. So what you do about the island on the right-hand side of the screen and how you connect that with, in policy terms, to food and livelihood and poverty, those are some of the big issues that we're facing. Am I okay on time?
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, so because I don't want to miss equity. So turning to equitable fishery systems, I don't have the answer to this question, but I just want to give you 4 particular aspects, I guess, that to me relate to equity. The first one is about values, and values is the idea of value. So I was initially trained partly as an economist, and so any economists in the room?
Yeah.
The economists, if you say the word value, they will probably put the word economic in front of it and say it's economic value. And then they'll assume that that's measured in currency of euros, let's say. Maybe not every economist, but some would look at it that way. And that's how I always looked at it until some community members, some Indigenous colleagues taught me how to think about values. Values is what we as humans feel is important. And the reason I put this here under equity is that respecting values for me came to be a really important ingredient for equitable relationships with other people, appreciating their values. The reason I have this particular diagram on the screen is a project that I'm involved with called Aramat, which is an international project, though funded out of Canada, but it's international, involves quite a few regions of the world. The website is shown on the bottom left there. And I show you that because I think there's a lot of good connections, perhaps with your work here. The project Aramat is it's Indigenous led, so it's not what is too common a situation of non-Indigenous researchers wanting to work with Indigenous people in Canada. That's a very common situation. This is actually led by Indigenous people, and a fairly large grant from the Canadian government. So, but it's decentralized to different countries of the world. And the reason I mention it is it deals with community, biodiversity, health, and sustainability. So it's dealing with many of the themes that that perhaps you're also interested in. So if you just like to explore that website at some point, I think that that you might find it interesting. At the bottom of the screen, I just put up two words, Sawak and Isak, that are actually principles of life from the Nachalnith people on the west side of Canada. So that's 7,000 kilometers from where I live. I'm closer, I think, to Santiago than I am to this location on the west side of Canada. But if it's in small print there, but Sawak is getting at the idea that everything is one and everything is connected, which is very similar to the concept we now have of ecosystem-based management. Isak is respect for everyone and everything. And that is essentially the translation that I was given. Everyone and everything sounds very all-inclusive, and that is how it's meant to be. So those are principles or values that kind of guide the Nachalnith people, and I've sort of found them inspiring. Number two, empowerment. So these are, for me, four routes towards an equitable situation. Empowerment. I'm only going to refer just to one form of empowerment, namely what we call community science. So this is from an article from a few years ago. Laura Loudon, Secret Burgess, Derek Armitage, some of my major collaborators in Canada on community science. So some of you have heard of citizen science. And community science contrasts with that because it's based on empowerment. It's based on the community deciding what science it needs, and then finding the people it wants to work with to do that science. So you see it turns it around from what I, as a researcher, am accustomed to thinking, which is that I create a project and then I find some Indigenous people to work with. It turns that around. So the community, but this doesn't have to be Indigenous, by the way. In fact, the community of Port Mattoon in Nova Scotia, which you've never heard of, it's a small little community in Nova Scotia, my province in Canada. That community is where I got the notion of this community science, because that community was leading the science activity. They were leading the research. They were deciding what research happened, when it happened, and who to work with. And so I've just taken from them that, and that's a non-Indigenous community. Three, equitable access. So the access, I usually think of access as being access to the fishery resources. In other words, the license or the ability to go fishing, and that's a very important part of it. But some work I'm doing at the moment with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, is changing how I'm looking at access, because we're looking at how small-scale fishery people can access 8 different aspects in fisheries. So yes, the resources and yes, the space are crucial. You know, there's fishers around the world who are excluded from even being able to get their boat out in the ocean because the coastal area has been privatized, like bought up. And so it's hard even to get their boat in the ocean. So that's a space issue, but also access to markets, to financing, to credit, access to social security and social protection, access to the technology that the fishers need. And that's not just the boats, but also the mobile phones and other equipment, access to information and knowledge, and access to legal services. So we're trying to look at equity from the point of view of access from all these different dimensions. And then finally, the question of distributional equity. And this, I'm happy to say, is an article that just came out, open access. If you're interested in privatization, which is like the buying up of the resources and the coastal and the ocean area, this is from a special issue of the journal Maritime Studies, where this looks at privatization or distributional equity from a number of different points. Distributional equity meaning who are the winners and who are the losers from different policy changes and different economic forces. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And then from these five points in the middle there, jurisdiction, the kinds of rights, the magnitude of privatization, the distributional implications, and one that we found particularly important, the community perceptions. And we looked at this just from one coastal community, and that coastal community is the one I just mentioned in Eastern Canada, Port Mattoon. We were looking at the implications of 3 different privatization impacts. From individual transferable quotas, which some of you would be familiar with as a fishery management tool, from fish farming development that affected the local fishery, and from coastal land ownership. So very different kinds of changing access. And one of the results we found just at the bottom of the screen there is that the community's perception of these 3 different aspects fit with their own values. So coming back to that idea of values earlier, more so than what you would expect from just what was actually happening. So for example, coastal land ownership, the land was being bought up when people were getting older and selling their land, it was being bought by outsiders. And that was changing the nature of the community. People from outside the community were buying the coastal land and it was affecting the local community. But the community didn't mind that because it brought new life into the community and it brought money into the community. And they actually were able to engage the newcomers in their local area. Their values were such that they could actually accept that. Whereas some of the other impacts were hurting people more directly. So the distributional aspect was actually quite complex in that case. Okay, well, I'm going to finish there, and I hope if there's any questions, I'd welcome it if there's time. So again, those 3 questions I was asking, what are fishery systems? What are the ingredients of sustainability? And what are equitable fishery systems? And I really would welcome you to check out some of the websites in the talk, but also any of these pamphlets that you might like to have a look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony, for the great talk and inspirational. So now it's time for questions here in the room or even online. Any questions, comments, please?
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to know more about how do you classify sustainability or sustainable criteria in different units of measurement, indicators, let's say indicators. What type of indicators do you use for sustainability that can be valid to declare one is sustainable, the other is not? Because you're talking about small scale, right? All the time.
Yes.
But, and what happens beyond small scale? What happens with large scale or industrial scale, industrial fishing also?
Yes, thank you. Very, very good points. Much of what I was referring to was not only for small scale fisheries, but I think the basic ideas of fishery systems apply to any fishery. So they're not, and the book that I was describing is not only for small scale. In fact, it's very much has a lot of examples of large scale fisheries. So, you know, I think there is both there, but you're quite right that for some of the aspects, in fact, for the discussion of the equity issues, I think I was looking in particular at the small scale. So you're absolutely. The book, actually, I do have a chapter on sustainability, and I should emphasize also on resilience. I didn't talk much about resilience here today, but to me, those are parallel aspects. Both are difficult to measure. Some would say resilience is even more difficult to measure. Some would note that it's very much a systems aspect. So you can't really, I mean, I suppose I could say that I am a resilient person, in some ways an individual, but it's really more of a systems concept, like the whole ecosystem, the whole fishery system, where sustainability tends to get looked at many different levels. But yes, so to get to your point about the indicators, I showed a triangle at the start that broke sustainability down into what the Brundtland Commission often has as social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And then I would insist also on an institutional sustainability as a fourth component, because if you don't have the institutions, or you could say governance sustainability, if you don't have the institutions working, then you probably can't do any of the other sustainability aspects. If it's totally a free-for-all without any governance, then it's hard to achieve sustainability. So I would say those four components of sustainability, each one, there are indicators that can be used. I think over the last 30-something years, there have been some generic indicators, and then some ones that, so there's indicators that are measured according to data that we already collect. And then there's better indicators that we should be measuring, but we don't necessarily collect the data for those. And therein, that it has quite a problem to it, in a sense. For example, if you measure the catch of fish, it doesn't tell you anything about sustainability. It just doesn't give you any idea. And I mean, catches can go up and then you collapse. So that's not sustainable. So to me, we need measures of sustainability indicators that are truly going to get at the carrying capacity aspects of ecosystem carrying capacity, and critical, well, I should say in fishery science, there are good measures of thresholds. I think that's one of the best scientific approaches to indicators, is to look at thresholds. But even then, that's typically a threshold for an individual species, whereas you also need thresholds at an ecosystem level. So amazingly, I mean, to me, it's remarkable that after more than 100 years of fishery science, formal fishery science, and of course, thousands of years of indigenous understanding, and now more than 40 years of work on indicators of sustainability, we still don't have the right indicators. I mean, we still don't really have ones that, I mean, there's some I created that nobody measures that I think are good, but nobody measures them. And then there's this effort to take something like catch and think that you're measuring sustainability. So you raise a really important point. So I put more focus on what governance measures, what strategies seem to support sustainability, at least support it in the way that I'm thinking of the sustainability. So yeah, it's a really crucial question.
Yeah, and one thing for me that is quite difficult to determine, to balance, or to identify is how to ensure that the fishery is sustainable in the way that it works. I mean, the vessel, the catch, the consumption of fuel, etc., and all the different inputs that the system requires. Yeah, that's one point. That is related to typically one single species, but maybe a mix that are catch, even an effort of the fishing effort. But apart from that is the biodiversity. How to protect the biodiversity if we are focusing on, let's say, one single species. Yeah, because for example, in terrestrial environment, yeah, it's quite more, perhaps more evident, yeah, that we are focusing on something and we need to check all the area to see if we have had any influence on the environment. But what happens, yeah, under the sea? Perhaps we are not so aware of this level of biodiversity, how we are protecting, because we have to think that not only coral reefs are important, or dolphins, or let's say, something like maybe a star, something that can be easily identified, but all the rest. For me, it's quite difficult, to identify this, how to protect also the biodiversity beyond, let's say, less environmental damaging activity related to fishery activity. What do you think?
I think that is a very important question, and I've been dealing with that in several different angles recently. One is, as I mentioned earlier, that at the international level, there are big efforts now for what's traditionally the fishery agency, the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's a United Nations agency, but traditionally it's focused on food production and fishery. Well, fisheries is one aspect of it. And then the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is working on the biodiversity side. And I might mention here also IPBES, which is also dealing with biodiversity from a kind of the think tank aspect, you might say. Like so you've got different biodiversity bodies, and you've got the fisheries bodies. And what I'm seeing recently is a real effort. I showed the book that I did a few years ago on linking fisheries and biodiversity, but there's an increasing effort, I think, to bring them together. We were showing the possibilities for coming together, but also the conflicts, and there still are conflicts, definitely. I mean, unfortunately, that's why I emphasize sustainable use as a concept, because there are some people who would like to shut down the ocean and just make it a park with no economic activity. And that would be good for biodiversity in theory. In practice, it wouldn't work. And in practice, it would probably be bad for biodiversity. Instead, what I've chosen to focus on are these wonderful examples of people who are conserving biodiversity because it works for them to do that. People in the tropics, communities that are helping the sea turtles to reproduce because it generates tourism income for them. They used to eat the turtle eggs. Now they help the turtles to reproduce because they can see the benefit, not just to make money, but they also understand the biodiversity aspect. And it's not unlike elephants in Africa, where there's similar efforts to sustain the elephant populations by helping the communities to live with the elephants. It's actually like there's some similarities there. So on biodiversity, the other aspect is in fisheries, implementing the ecosystem approach. If we do that properly, thinking about the ecosystem, not just about the fish species, then we change how we're viewing the world in a sense. And that's not just a kind of environmentalist way of doing it. It actually, I think we've shown that an ecosystem approach is good for fisheries. So I think there's different angles that try to do what you're talking about. It's a challenge though, because there's always that balance of human needs and biodiversity. And trying to find the right balance, trying to find equity in there is so important.
Thank you. More questions or comments?
So maybe talking about that equity, because I completely agree. It seems like there are conflicting objectives between, say, wanting to conserve biodiversity and actually getting economic gains from fishing. And it's funny how you say that, you know, actually giving people more access to the ocean is a way to actually conserve it. For me, that seems conflicting. So how would you actually implement, say, guidelines or rules to make sure that that balance is actually kept in check?
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, I just have to say, I don't want to be quoted as saying that giving people more access to the ocean would help. Because there's the key ingredient is governance.
There you go. Yeah.
The key ingredient is people making decisions over their activity.
But how do you convince people to, you know, have that mindset? Because that's the point where we need to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, first of all, there's different governance mechanisms. Some communities in some places in the world, local people make their own decisions. Like in indigenous communities, that can be the situation. In the Pacific Islands, locally it can happen. And in that situation, well, they need to make the right decisions. But in a larger scale national setting, where well, you need government. I mean, I hate to say it, where when there's certain places in the world that seem to not see the need for government, that you actually need government making policy, and regulating things. I mean, ideally, the government is doing that in the right way, but that's why. Well, so I'm one who believes in devolution of governance when that's possible. The EU has a particular policy about decentralization. Anybody recall the term? I've used it many times in talks. I can't remember every time, but it's the idea of making the decision at the most local level that is sensible in the situation. So generally it might be called devolution, but it's carefully choosing what the right level is. So if the right level is the national government, that's one thing. If the right level is the municipal governments, that's like in the Philippines, fisheries are managed by municipalities. Thanks to a national law, there's a national law that says that they're giving the management to the municipalities, at least for some fisheries. So it's an amazing legislation, but that has worked in the Philippines when the municipalities have enough capability, right? So there's also capability, but how to make it actually work in practice? Yes, it is difficult, but I think what we found over time, over the many decades, is that open access, you know, just giving more people access to the ocean is not the solution. It's managing the commons, like the ocean is the commons, but managing it in a way that keeps it sustainable and equitable, in a way that that's fair, that provides sustainable use, and that that tries to manage in a careful way. So that probably doesn't answer the question. But I'm trying to be a politician here, and then, you know.
So could we maybe frame it like this? If let's say we have these small communities, like these indigenous communities, they know how to manage it. They have a certain, you know, population to feed, and they have the local knowledge to do it. But the part which really gets me is that nationwide. So, you know, you want, I don't know, someone from Madrid wants fish from Galicia. It has to go from there to there, and has to be a big quantity. Like, how do we manage exactly that demand? Do you think that the demand should become less or that?
Okay, okay, well, if we can, yeah, we talk about demand, then that's, yes, that is a different, different topic, right? Because that's, yeah, that goes beyond fishery, the management of the fishery as such, but I mean, the management of food supply in a country is a very different, issue, and yet, I mean, it is incredibly important. I mean, in some countries, getting the fish from the coast to the inland cities is a huge issue. Preservation of the fish, I mean, these are getting into technicalities in a way, but some of the distribution aspects need a lot more work and support than they might have had before. But fundamentally, I mean, if I just take your point, we can't feed the whole world based on capture fisheries, on fish that we capture from the ocean. Can't do it.
Yeah.
Who gets those fish? Is it a market based on market price? Is it based on proximity, how close you are to where the fish are? It probably currently is a mix of those two, right? Some people pay big money to get fish where they want the fish. The lobster that's caught off the coast of Canada, much of it gets shipped to Asia and, well, until recently, the United States. We could have a separate seminar on that topic if you like. And some of it goes to Europe, the lobster. Probably we'd like to have more of it going to Europe. So if you can arrange that, let's do that. But the lobster is high priced. You know, it's a high price thing. So it's not feeding the world in some sense. Whereas the fish that's caught off of West Africa or various other parts of the world is you know, some of that is feeding the coastal people, right? So I mean, we have very different supply and demand situations. And I mean, as long as we know that fish that's captured in the ocean can't feed everybody, then we have to start talking about, you know, the allocation question. Which, by the way, I'm like on a totally different topic of climate change. I'm always struck by when I learned the concept, this might seem obvious to you all, that to prevent climate catastrophe, there's only a certain amount of carbon that can be put into the atmosphere from here on. And thinking about it in that sense, like, because 1.5 degrees is hard to kind of appreciate in some sense. You know, 1.5 degrees was the amount of global warming that was considered somehow acceptable. And now I guess we've gone past that, but it's hard to really, like, you can't walk around really measuring 1.5, but you can actually put that into the amount of carbon that can still go into the atmosphere. And I'm sorry, this is a different talk, but when you think of it that way, it becomes very clear that the question is who gets to put that carbon into the atmosphere? Starting today, who gets to put that remaining allowable amount of carbon into the atmosphere?
And same with fisheries.
Same with fisheries. Exactly. I mean,
So we have a budget.
there,
So we have kind of a budget that you think a budget.
a budget, well, in a way, but it's an allocation issue, right? It's an allocation issue for fisheries and an allocation issue in terms of national carbon allowances. I mean, if we really were serious about the carbon aspect, it would get worked out, right? I mean, is it those who are emitting the most now that get to keep emitting the most? Is it those who never had a chance to emit the carbon into the atmosphere that now should get a chance? Like, I can't decide that, right? I mean, I can't decide also on fisheries, but these are huge challenges. And I mean, when you think about equity, it's kind of fundamental when you only have, I used to think about allocation in you may know the concept of total allowable catch, which we would in English say TAC in a fishery. And when you have a TAC, it's like a pie, you know, a fruit pie or whatever kind of pie you like to eat. And then you divide up the pie, and some fishing groups get more pie and some get less pie. And there's a certain amount of pie. So every year in the fishery, there's that pie. But in a sense, when we talk about food for people, the pie is the amount of fish that's available on a sustainable basis. And who gets that? And then for carbon in the atmosphere, yeah, the same kind of idea. I mean, yeah, you can think about the budget and who gets the budget.
Great comments and conversation. Yes, please, yes, one question, NG. Yeah.
I would like to know a little bit more about these OECMs areas. This is my first question. And the second question is going beyond my colleague. What about the international aspect of fisheries? What about this deep ocean catchment places? Because we talk a lot about the coastal fisheries. But from your perspective, from the FAO perspective, is it possible to have an international agreement on fisheries? Is it possible? Is it even possible? Is it necessary to have?
Oh, wow. Okay, so first of all, you're somewhat familiar with marine protected areas? Yeah. The areas of the ocean that are set aside with certain regulations, right? The feature of an MPA is that if they're going to be registered internationally, the country that's doing it needs to say that the main purpose is for conservation. The main purpose of a marine protected area is for conservation. That might seem obvious to you, but I mean, but the reason I'm saying that is that for an OECM, the main purpose does not have to be conservation. The main purpose could be because the people have a sacred site in the ocean that they think is so important to their culture that they don't go fishing there because culturally it's very important. Nothing to do with conservation. But if doing that, having that area of the ocean where they don't go fishing, also supports biodiversity, then that area could become an OECM. So that's essentially the concept. If a government has an area that is protected for some reason, but it's not officially a marine protected area, but it also let me give an example. Suppose that there is a shipwreck off the coast, a ship that's sunk, and it's become a park because the divers like to go down to see the shipwreck. It's not a conservation area, but it could become an OECM if the government says that there's biodiversity benefits from that area. So it doesn't have to have conservation as its first priority, but it could, as long as it has biodiversity benefits, it could become an OECM. That's the concept. And it's a really neat idea, but it is controversial because the strong-minded environmentalists don't want just any area to get to be an OECM. They want to restrict it somehow. Sorry,
But it does still sound like a marine protected area. Yeah, like, because you're still not fishing in there.
Yeah.
You're just giving it a different label in a sense.
Yes. Okay.
I don't know.
You're right. You're right. I went through decades giving talks on marine protected areas. I never made this distinction. So, and this is just in the last 7 years that it started to get talked about more. But so, yeah. So there's marine protected areas that are marine and they're protected and they're areas. But then there's officially designated marine protected areas. So this answers your question, I hope, because if something is an officially registered marine protected area, then it is like classified internationally as that. And then an OECM, that's not an OECM. An OECM is one that has not been officially classified as a marine protected area.
So let's say it's a legally easier marine protected area.
Sorry?
It's like legally easier to make it protected using this OECM.
It could be easier, yes, yeah, but like if, are we still on screen here or not? If this is an area of the ocean, right, it's a rectangle, that's an area of the ocean. You and I might agree that this is a marine protected area, unofficially, just because it's protected and it's marine and it's an area, you know. But if the government registers this, it then becomes an official marine protected area. If the government didn't register this, but we know that it works for biodiversity, we could make it an OECM. If it's already been registered as a marine protected area, you cannot make it an OECM. That's just the way the rules work. And this is like the international rules, and you're like, I'm like somebody from the Convention on Biological Diversity tried to explain this because it's very weird, you know. But I'm sure time is limited, so let me just get to your other point. Oh, the international aspect. The biggest thing that has happened internationally in recent years that I must say I have not been closely part of is the BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. You can work out the acronym and what it might be in Spanish, I'm not sure, but BBNJ is what people wander around saying, like it's in their sleep or something, because it was a huge negotiation, a bit like back in the 1970s when there was something called UNCLOS, UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention. It's almost as big as the Law of the Sea, but it's all about biodiversity outside of 200 nautical mile limits. So outside of national territory. And this was incredibly important because it was the first time that biodiversity, well, you could give a talk on this, couldn't you? The first time that biodiversity has really been negotiated outside of any national jurisdiction. And so I think that that's getting at the idea that you're raising about the national, but in terms of the earlier point about who gets the fish out of the ocean, I don't think that's ever been really thought about too much. Because we have the national jurisdictions and then we have the outside national jurisdictions doesn't have a lot of fish really there. I mean, I know there's tuna out like roaming the seas and such, but it's really more closer to the coast is where the actual bulk of the fish is. How we figure out who gets the fish, knowing that not everybody can have it. And I realize I haven't talked about fish aquaculture today, really, because this wasn't a talk on aquaculture, but my friends at FAO will certainly point out that now more aquaculture fish is produced than is caught. Right, so that's a huge change in the dynamic of the world in some sense. I just couldn't cover that today. So thank you.
I think that we have a last question from G. No?
Yes, thank you. I've got a question about perceptions. I study values and attitudes, so I'm really interested in perceptions and also governance. It kind of follows on from your questions. I read an article yesterday about a global study that was just published on people's attitudes towards conservation of the environment. And apparently, so they were asked, first of all, what proportion of population do you think in your country is interested in conserving or is worried about climate change? And people said on average, well, probably about 40% of the population are worried about it. And then when they were asked themselves, okay, so are you interested in, concerned about climate change? Then the figures went up to 80% of the, on average, of the global population from this survey said that they were concerned about climate change. And so the perceptions that people have is that fewer of us are actually concerned than who are actually concerned. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that I think that I don't know whether we're approaching a tipping point where all of this conservation work that's been going on for so many decades, and the advances that we've made in messaging. So the conservation movement has changed from publishing bad news messages and fear and trying to make people really worried about what we're losing, to now showing the positive stories. If you act, you can save this. If you get involved, then we can change things. And you can see all around the world these social movements happening, these demonstrations against Trump. I mean, it's just incredible what's going on. And there's a lot of activity, I think, and a lot of positive movement. And I'm wondering whether we're approaching a positive tipping point where people are now saying, yes, we do want change. We want our governments to govern better on our behalf. But we're just not really seeing that, because the messages that we're still getting from the media are that everything's going downhill, because a lot of things are going downhill. But I think part of our problem may be the way that the science that we do and the work that we do is communicated in a way that doesn't really help our cause in the national media, for example. And I'm wondering whether we really need governance of governments. Because, people want governments to do the right thing. We want to implement policies that will protect the planet. But there's this hesitance, this reluctance, this infighting, there's all these debates about who's going to pay for what and who's responsible and why should we look after these countries when, we've got to look after ourselves and protectionism and all these things going on. And I'm not keen on more and more levels of governance, because I think that for many of us, if you have a relationship with something that's important to you, and I think the relationships that, you were talking about governance before, and I think that it is based on geographic distance. If you're close to something that you care about, then you tend to have a stronger relationship with it, yeah? We found this in our value chain analysis, where we've been interviewing fishers who are small-scale fishers who are very keen and who are actively working to protect their fisheries, because it's so important to them and their livelihoods and their communities. And yet when you try to engage with businesses that are more towards the middle of the value chain, so the processors, and who are further away from the resource or from the biodiversity, their values are different, because they're more interested in profit. They don't see the fish as biodiversity or as life. They see it as a product. And so for me, there's this geographic distance as well, in terms of who needs to be governed, maybe. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this very clearly, but I think my point is that at a smaller scale, people seem to be wanting to act in a way that's sustainable, and doing that where possible, because there's the ability to do it. You can act locally. You have access to land. You can change things yourself. Whereas companies, the industries that are a bit further away, that are have a less strong relational value to the biodiversity itself, need to be managed and governed. And the governments also need to somehow give a kick up the backside.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really good points. Yeah, actually, I mean, who makes the decision and what the level of decision, should be, that's a really, can be a tough one. I used to, when I became enthused about community-based management and the ideas of Eleanor Ostrom and others, Fikret Berkus, on decisions made locally, I thought that was sort of universally a good idea. And I've spent the last 20 or 25 years documenting how good it can be to make decisions locally at the community or local level. But there's also times when it doesn't work. And there's times when a national government can, I hate to say this, but when a national government can know better or can look at a big picture, I mean, somebody has to balance. Like if we are agreeing that not everybody gets everything they want, somebody's got to make some decisions about allocation. And it's difficult for a local community to make a decision about allocation with another local community. I mean, they can negotiate something, but it can be difficult. So, I mean, there's definitely challenges, but to me, the really, there's some really good news as well, though. I mean, one is that if you're keen on the state of the ocean, like if you're keen on, let's say, the conservation angle, then I think the points that we've been talking about today about biodiversity are really positive. Right from the international level down to the local level, you've got people appreciating the idea of biodiversity more than in the past. In the fishery in particular, and I don't mean everybody that you talk to at the dock, but the general appreciation of the ocean and the biodiversity in the ocean, I think is better than it used to be. Number two, if you're particularly interested in the people involved in the fisheries and in the oceans, I think there's a positive angle. And in fisheries in particular, and not that the world is only small scale fisheries, but 10 years ago, the small scale fisheries guidelines were agreed to by the whole world community. And it's not just for small scale fisheries. I like to point out this, the small scale fisheries guidelines are for all fisheries, because what they recognize is this systems idea that you have to look at ecosystems, that you have to look at human systems, that you can't only look at the people in the boats catching the fish, but also the fishing communities. You have to look at decent work, at gender issues, at the social fabric of the system. And that is really good for the people side. Like having that kind of holistic view of the people and having a more holistic view of nature and biodiversity, I think that's really positive aspects. It doesn't solve a lot of the issues about governance and you know the decision making, but I think there's some real positive progress that we've seen in the last, let me say, 10 years. And so that is my last word, except please help yourself to these here and this stuff there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.